So this is our final session. It has been quite a journey. We appreciate all the nice emails that we've been getting from some of you about how rewarding this has been. And I just want to say it's been very mutual. Getting to learn with Sean and to learn with you and from you has been extremely gratifying, much more than I think we even anticipated. And so we kind of left the syllabus somewhat fluid, and we decided for our final session to try actually teaching together and also bringing actors from North and South together. And instead of doing a monologue, to do a scene. So we're going to be doing the scene from Twelfth Night. Our topic today is wit. We're turning to wit. Wit has come up periodically in our conversations, and we wanted to give a little attention to wit in relationship to wisdom, wit as a virtue, and what comedy might add to kind of sense of Shakespeare's philosophy of life. And so I began my thinking with the classical philosophers, beginning with Aristotle. In Aristotle's Ethics, he does represent wit as one of the virtues. It's not one of the four cardinal virtues that we talked about last time, but it's one of the social virtues, along with affability and veracity. It's interesting that veracity is considered a social rather than a moral virtue, and that could be its own topic to explore that. But by wit or wittiness, eutropelia, Aristotle really meant the urbane and intellectually and verbally fluid and flexible gentleman or citizen who would be able to be witty in conversation. And like all of his virtues, he presents wit as the mean between two extremes. The boor, B-O-O-R, is the person without wit at all. And the buffoon is the person who jokes all the time. And he connects wit, eutropelia, to what is called eutropoi, meaning good at turning, deft or nimble, versatile, literally versatile, dexterous. Because he says this kind of thing, meaning witty conversation, is like character in motion. And I think that the element of mobility is quite nice to think about when we look at the play and sport and kinesthetics of humor and comedy in Shakespeare, even when that comedy is largely verbal. I think wit has a role to play in Plato as well. And I'm thinking here in particular of Socratic irony, which we don't think of as ha-ha funny. But if you get into reading Plato, you can feel the humor running through parts of it. Socratic irony involves a dialogue in which questioning, often posing as naive questioning, draws out and exposes the preconceptions in the interlocutor, the student, the would-be sage. And here's how Socrates is described in the Symposium. He spends his whole life pretending and playing with people. And I think that gives you a sense of the dramatic quality of at least some of the Socratic dialogues, as well as the playful and ironic quality of those dialogues. Twelfth Night's Feste would have been played by Robert Armin. I've given you on one side of this slide the folio list of actors in Shakespeare's company. And William Kemp was the earlier clown in the company, and he was known for physical humor. He was quite an athlete, a juggler, a dancer, and his humor would, let's say, perhaps veer a little bit towards the buffoon. And Robert Armin came in right around when Twelfth Night is written, and his humor is primarily verbal as well as musical. And he probably can be seen as a collaborator with Shakespeare on these verbally dexterous eutropoi characters like Feste and Touchstone and also the Fool and King Lear, all of whom would have been played by Robert Armin. Armin was also an author. He wrote a play, a poem, and a joke book, a collection of witticisms and gags. And here we can really see some overlap between the joke and the proverb, between wit in its narrow sense of humor or wittiness, and wit in its much larger Renaissance sense to simply mean intelligence. And so we talked about commonplace books. Commonplace books resemble in some ways these joke books. On the right side of the screen, you see Wits Treasury. This is a very important commonplace book that includes some very important early references to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare certainly would have known this work. And there, Wits Treasury is not referring to jokes per se, but to wisdom. And so an interesting overlap there in terms of the different traditions that we have been looking at. I'm going to turn it over now to Sean to talk about comedy in Shakespeare and wit in Shakespeare.
Thanks, Julia. And I'll just say as a word of thanks and acknowledgement on my own part that it's just been a fantastic 8 weeks with all of you. And I want to say something about Julia that I said to her graduate students when I visited her seminar earlier this year. You may have already sorted it out for yourselves, but Julia is, in my view, the person who's doing the most important kind of work that could be done in Shakespeare studies and in the humanities generally today. No one else has the courage to place questions of wisdom and virtue and humanity in its broadest sense at the center of her work. That's not really where research universities and the humanities in those universities are today. So you're at the cutting edge of something that I hope will turn into a new preoccupation for us, or an old preoccupation made new again. And that's all down to Julia for having the creativity and, as I said, the courage to bring us into this world together. So with that, I want to say that there's another tradition that we wanted you to be aware of before we hear the actors perform this scene. And that is a tradition that Shakespeare would have learned in school, a certain way of thinking about comedy, about its origins, its purpose, its nature, and about comic wit in particular. I'm showing you a picture of William Kemp, the other clown in Shakespeare's company, just as a placeholder while I tell you this story about what Shakespeare learned at school. So from Cicero, who was a statesman and a Stoic philosopher, Shakespeare would have learned in school that language is a unique human endowment, that it is what draws us to each other and what lies at the foundation of our capacity to make societies together. And in that context, he would also have learned from Cicero that witty language, Shakespeare would have seen Cicero using a word in Latin that means shining. We might say sparkling, or to change the metaphor a little, effervescent. Sparkling language, effervescent language, witty language had a special function to perform in the human uses of language for the purposes of constructing and maintaining societies. And it was to diffuse bad temper and to maintain peaceful relations between people who might be in conflict for one reason or another. Cicero was clear in sort of Aristotelian terms that if you couldn't take a joke, there was something wrong with you, right? And if you were too apt to make jokes at the expense of other people's, there was something wrong with you too. So the mean between these two extremes was the place where wit performed a wholesome social function in bringing people together, creating families, creating societies and their institutions. In addition to all of that, Shakespeare also learned a story about comedy, and it has two main features, which I'll share with you now. The first feature of this story about comedy is that from antiquity, comedy was an inherently didactic genre, right? Comedy is always teaching somebody a lesson. It targets vices and grandiose thoughts and all sorts of antisocial behavior that threaten the peace and stability of an existing social order. Comic wit directs laughter at bad behavior and stigmatizes it. It aims to create a sense of shame in the offender. And shame is the offender's opening to laugh at himself and to engage in self-criticism, and in this way to reintegrate himself into the society from which he's departed by behaving antisocially. And presumably the shame that comedy is creating for the offender is also a deterrent to other people not to behave in the way that he had behaved. The second feature of this story about comedy that Shakespeare learned at school is that it's in the nature of comic wit, mockery, jokes, jests, puns, all those species of wit that Shakespeare excels at. It's in the nature of wit like that to get out of hand and to become a threat to harmony and stability in its own right. Now, in what sense, or why would I say that? Well, for one thing, when comedians pass judgment on other people, they are asserting a moral authority that they really haven't earned. And in that sense, comedy is always itself insubordinate, according to the theory that Shakespeare was sort of steeped in school. And when vicious behavior is made laughable, there's always a risk that onlookers will come to associate vice with the pleasure of laughing, right? And that is to say that comedy may cure its target of his vices, but it might infect many more people by teaching them that it's okay to laugh at what they should be abhorring. And finally, becoming the object of laughter isn't a lot of fun, and it may make that person worse than he was to begin with. And you can think about Twelfth Night in this context. Malvolio enters the play as a very proud man, but after he's humiliated over the course of the play, he turns into a vengeful man, and his intention to revenge himself on the people who have made fun of him in the comedy creates all sorts of problems that are unresolved when the play comes to an end. This theory that I'm sketching for you is so thoroughly part of Shakespeare's meditation on his art and on his own prodigious wit that it often percolates to the surface of the plays that he's writing as aspects of dialogue or as scenes. Here I'm showing you just a snippet of As You Like It. Duke Senior in the woods is talking to one of his courtiers, Jaques. Jaques has run into Touchstone, who's the fool in this play, in another part of the forest, and listened to Touchstone making fun of somebody. And he's decided, that's my career, that's my future, right? I can't be a courtier anymore because we're in exile, so I'll be a fool. And he says, I must have liberty withal, as large a charter as the wind, to blow on whom I please, for so fools have, and they that are most galled with my folly, they must laugh. And he says further along in that passage, I see I haven't highlighted it, at the bottom, give me leave to speak my mind, and I will through and through cleanse the foul body of the infected world if they will patiently receive my medicine, right? There's Jaques speaking from that side of comic theory that comedy is a therapy. It's a medicine for some ailment in the social body. And Duke Senior responds to him by saying that from the sort of other side of the story of comedy that I'm teaching you about today, he responds, most mischievous foul sin in chiding sin, for thou thyself hast been a libertine, as sensual as the brutish sting itself, and all the embossed sores and headed evils that thou with license of free foot hast caught, wouldst thou disgorge into the general world, right? You're not the doctor, you're the disease, right? So that's just to say that Shakespeare is frequently sort of replaying this tension at the heart of comedy as he learned to think about it theoretically in his own comedies. In Twelfth Night, Feste and Viola, in disguise as the page Cesario, have another conversation about wit that we haven't shown you for today, but it's just as relevant. Here, Shakespeare seems to be suggesting, or they seem to be in agreement, that witticism is a symptom of a decadent society and also a source of decadence in its own right. Feste says, to see this age, a sentence, that's a proverb, a sentence is but a cheverel glove to a good wit. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. A cheverel glove is a goat-skinned glove. Some of you may know that Shakespeare's father was a glove maker. He's saying that proverbs have become so unstable and manipulable in the age we live in that I can turn them inside out with a good wit and make them mean the opposite of what they actually mean. And Viola responds, nay, that's certain. They that dally nicely with words may quickly make them wanton, right? So the metaphor of sort of disease and infection that has you saw in As You Like It is carried over into this play, and it sort of made sexual, right? There's something wrong, something slightly dirty about fiddling with words in a witty manner. So here's a section from the end of Love's Labour's Lost, which is an earlier comedy, in which you see Rosaline taking issue with her lover Baron's fertile wit, right? And she's arguing that wit is a power that he's using to make other people suffer for his own pleasure. A man replete with mocks, full of comparisons and wounding flouts, which you on all estates will execute that lie within the mercy of your wit. No one is safe from your wit, right? So she's also capturing the idea there that there's something insubordinate about Baron's capacity to make people ridiculous. So her solution for Baron, her demand for Baron, is that she orders him to spend a year doing stand-up for the terminally ill, so that he can learn that the meaning and the value of witticism, what she calls in the other passage that I've highlighted there, a jest's prosperity, is for the audience to determine and not the speaker. Rosaline's perspective that wit is apt to become tyrannical is only one measurement of Shakespeare's ambivalence about the substance of comedy, namely making fun of other people, but it's a really memorable one for me. So the critical tradition came to regard Shakespeare's own wit with similar ambivalence. And perhaps his critics learned how to be ambivalent about his wit by reading and watching his plays. This is his friend Ben Jonson, actually a section of his Commonplace book, which was published after his death in 1640, saying that Shakespeare's wit is a gift that Shakespeare could not control, despite the fact that he himself was a good man. I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honor to Shakespeare, that in his writing whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out a line. My answer hath been, would he had blotted 1,000, which they thought was malevolent speech. I had not told posterity this, but for the ignorance of those that who chose that circumstance to commend their friend wherein he most faulted, the fact that he never blotted out a line. And to justify mine own candor, for I love the man and do honor his memory on this side of idolatry as much as any. He was indeed honest and of an open and free nature. He had excellent fantasy, brave notions, and gentle expressions, wherein he flowed with that facility that sometimes it was necessary he should be stopped. His wit was in his own power, would the rule of it had been so too. But he redeemed his vices with his virtues, and there was ever more in him to be praised than to be pardoned. I'm never really quite sure where that passage is going to end when I teach it, but there you see Jonson taking into a comment on Shakespeare's character and on Shakespeare's artistic ability, the very sort of divided way that Shakespeare himself seems to be looking at the nature of wit in his own plays. Right, so I'll just say as a final word of preface to the reading, that the background that I'm giving you here, I hope will help you to reflect on what Shakespeare is doing in this scene. After a demonstration of fooling by Feste, in which Feste makes fun of Olivia for her melancholy attachment to her dead brother, he and Olivia and Malvolio are going to turn to a discussion about wit and about fools that suggests that there's much more at stake than the way Olivia is grieving, although that's an important topic too. And so while you listen to the actors read this scene, ask yourselves, at whom are we being asked to laugh? And for what purpose? And where does our laughter leave us when the scene ends?
Wit, and it be thy will, put me into good fooling. Those wits that think they have thee do very oft prove fools, and I that am sure I lack thee may pass for a wise man. For what says Quinopolis? Better a witty fool than a foolish wit. Ah! God bless thee, lady.
Take the fool away.
Do not you hear, fellows? Take away the lady.
Go to, you're a dry fool. I'll know more of you. Besides, you grew dishonest.
2 faults, Madonna, that drink and good counsel will amend. For give the dry fool drink, then is the fool not dry. Bid the dishonest man mend himself. If he mend, he is no longer dishonest. If he cannot, let the botcher mend him. Anything that's mended is but patched. Virtue that transgresses is but patched with sin, and sin that amends is but patched with virtue. If that this simple syllogism will serve, so. If it will not, what remedy? As there is no true cuckold but calamity, so beauty's a flower. The lady bade take away the fool, therefore, I say again, take her away.
Sir, I bade them take away you.
Misprision in the highest degree. Lady, cacalis non facet monaca. That's as much to say as I wear not motley in my brain. Good Madonna, give me leave to prove you a fool.
Can you do it?
Dexterously, good Madonna.
Make your proof.
I must catechize you for it, Madonna. Good, my mouse of virtue. Answer me.
Well, sir, for want of other idleness, I'll bid your proof.
Good Madonna, why mournest thou?
Good fool, for my brother's death.
I think his soul is in hell, Madonna.
I know his soul is in heaven, fool.
The more fool you, Madonna, to mourn for your brother's soul being in heaven. Take away the fool, gentlemen.
What think you of this, Malvolio? Doth he not mend?
Yes, and shall do till the pangs of death shake him. Infirmity that decays the wise doth ever make the better fool.
God send you, sir, a speedy infirmity, for the better increasing your folly. Sir Toby will be sworn that I am no fox, but he will not pass his word for tuppence that you are no fool.
How say you to that, Malvolio?
I marvel that your ladyship takes delight in such a barren rascal. I saw him put down the other day with an ordinary fool that has no more brain than a stone. Look you now, he's out of his guard already. Unless you laugh and minister occasion to him, he's gagged. I protest, I take these wise men that crow so at these set kind of fools no better than the fool's zanies.
Oh, you are sick of self-love, Malvolio, and taste with a distempered appetite. To be generous, guiltless, and free of disposition is to take those things for bird bolts that you deem cannon bullets. There is no slander in an allowed fool, though he do nothing but rail, nor no railing in a known discreet man, though he do nothing but reprove.
O Mercury, endue thee with leasing, for thou speakest well of fools.
Thank you, guys. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I just on the slide, I've indicated some places where feste is clearly, when I say feste, I also mean Shakespeare, I also mean Robert Armin, who might have contributed to the composition of this, pulling on proverbial phrases. What to me is the essence of the first part of this scene is this enigmatic line, anything that's mended is but patched, Virtue that transgresses is but patched with sin, and sin that amends is but patched with virtue. So I just want to open it up to you and find out some of the ways in which you interpret what Feste is saying and why this might be kind of key to the drama.
Oh, can you still hear me? Yes. No, it's very tricky. Patching something is just surface disguise, isn't it? Doesn't change the fundamental nature of what's underneath.
That's certainly part of the sense here.
Yes.
Right? We've got mending and we've got patching.
Yes.
Right. And mending seems to have to do with can people improve? Is moral reform possible?
Yes.
And he's saying that, yes, it is. Let the botcher mend him. And yet he also seems to say, but that mending might be limited in its effects. It might be a mere patching. And of course, patching is also a reference to the fool's outfit.
Yes.
Right? He's the motley fool, and he wears an outfit that is all patched. So he's also kind of referring to his own state.
Yes.
He's been asked to amend himself by Olivia, and he says, I do amend myself, but it's through a kind of a patchwork. So there's a kind of interest in his own office as a fool, and some kind of commentary here on virtue and vice and moral improvement.
I think it might also help to see the conversation in the context of the fact that Feste has sort of been missing in action for an undefined period of time. He moves back and forth between Olivia's household and Orsino's household. He's one of only two characters who does that over the course of the play. And, she's been mourning for her brother, and he has not been there to cheer her up. So I've always, in teaching this scene, I've always approached it that there's something awkward they have to get past before she invites him to make fun of her, right? I mean, after she says, okay, do you think you can do it? Go for it, right? But that's not where they start. There's a rift between them that has to be managed. And in effect, there's something that has to be patched up between them. And he starts talking about patches at the very moment where that's happening. He's not really apologizing. And she's not really saying, boy, I wish you had been here to help me after my brother died, help cheer me up. But he comes out with this idea that, this is who I am. I'm patched up, right? I'm a mix of good and bad. Take me as I come. Something like that, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what's going on here.
I always wondered if at the beginning of this scene, he is in a way fighting for his job, because he could get the sack.
Yeah.
That's been mooted, that he might get the sack. So wit and be thy will put me into good fooling. I've got to use the only means I can to keep my job. So the scene becomes, I've always felt that the scene is a sort of rivalry for the love of Olivia between Malvolio and Feste, and also to keep their jobs. It would be marvelous for Malvolio if Feste got sacked.
Right, and that certainly comes up in the sort of end of the scene, which we'll get to shortly. But Malvolio is present and listening. And clearly these are two very different types of comic characters.
But he's watching him
we
sweat.
have on stage. Yeah.
He watches him sweat and thinks he may have burnt his boats when he says your brother is in hell. I think he hopes that he's burnt his boats.
There's an intensity there. There's a risk taking.
Absolutely.
With that particular line. Yeah. I'm just gonna, here are some of the thoughts that I had, possibility of moral change being offered, but also which is really a classical humanist notion of ethics, some shadowing of that with the sense that moral change on one's own without grace is limited. So a kind of Augustinian shadow in there. And then I think the sense that virtue is patched, right? That we are good and evil. And that in the world, our actions are always going to be mixed. And that Olivia, coming in all in black with her face covered in a veil is the opposite of patched.
Yeah.
Right. She doesn't like the mixed character of life in this world. And so she withdraws from it. And he's, through dialogue, kind of inviting her in to become more patched, to become more vulnerable, to open herself up to amendment. And that is, in a sense, the flow of this very Socratic dialogue, which I'm going to, I think, skip so that we get to the Malvolio section with Sean. But he really proceeds as a kind of a Socratic fool in this next part, using question and answer to draw out her own misconceptions about what it means to be virtuous in the world.
I mean, she's an unmarried woman, and her father is dead too. And in the Elizabethan framework, right, that is a unstable position for her household to be in, right? So Paul is exactly right to say that Malvolio and Feste are entering into a rivalry here, not to be her lovers, although Malvolio will take it in that direction in his fantasies, but to be her advisors, right? Who is going to advise her about how to conduct herself? And you see two different faces of comedy emerge in their rivalry. In Malvolio's case, it's a form of comedy that sort of tends towards satire and fault finding, right? And to a kind of strict defense of certain moral norms. And I agree with Paul too, that I think he's irritated later in this scene that Feste has made fun of heaven and hell in the process of cheering Olivia up. And on the other hand, there's Feste who, shows Olivia what it's like to be able to take abuse from her. She says, "You're dishonest, get out," right? To take abuse from her and to change that into not hostility, but something like a conversation where she can begin to see herself and her mourning critically, and therefore to sort of free herself from this melancholy that's kept her confined to her home and uninterested in relationships with other people.
And relationships with other people expose us to risk and to error and to mistake, and therefore to amending and repair. And without mistake, we can't be amended or repaired. And that seems to be one of the central insights of so much Shakespearean drama. Sean, do you want to look at this Malvolio and Olivia and Feste exchange with us?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, if you look at the second half of the scene where Olivia invites Malvolio into the conversation, and I think that in itself is a significant gesture, right? He's a bystander to her conversation with the fool. She expands the circle of conversation. Evidently, Feste has had a good effect on her, right? Feste has teased her a little bit out of her mourning, out of her self-enclosure in her grief. And what does she do with that opening? She opens the conversation to Malvolio and says, "What do you think?" Right? And he completely misreads what's happened there, I think. He doesn't understand that something good has happened for Olivia. And instead he responds with this really caustic attack on Feste, right? To make the difference between them clear. And Feste responds in kind with aggression, right? Aggression for aggression. Olivia is now the bystander to the conversation, right? And again gives Malvolio an opportunity to, keep the conversation going on a different footing. What do you say to that, right? And he now responds with an even harsher criticism of Feste. And I'm not entirely sure whether he realizes that in doubling down on his attack on Feste, he has expanded the attack to include Olivia herself. "I marvel your ladyship takes delight in such a barren rascal," right? He's aiming at Feste again, but he hits Olivia with that, right? "Look you now, he's out of his guard already. Unless you laugh and minister occasion to him, he's gagged. I protest, I take these wise men that crow so at this set kind of fools no better than fools zanies." That is a zany is like the head of a fool that looks like the fool that he carries on the end of a scepter, right? He's just told Olivia, his mistress, that if she thinks that there's wisdom in what Feste has said, then she's no better than the rattle that the fool uses to entertain people, right? That's a terrible miscalculation on his part. And she then responds with a kind of theoretical statement about how wit and folly really work, right? You are sick of self-love, which is also an attack on Malvolio. Oh, you are sick of self-love, Malvolio, and taste with a distempered appetite, etc., etc. So, and then finally, Feste has the last word in this scene, right? He has the last word, but it's a last word that reestablishes Olivia's authority to determine what the whole conversation has meant, right? So all of this, this presentation of wit in this scene has taken place because it isn't clear who's in charge in the household, and because Olivia has withdrawn from society, and because Feste has been off on his own and not doing his job, and because Malvolio has filled these voids with his pride, right? And at the end of the conversation, it has shaken out that Olivia is in charge again. She gets to say what wit means, and she gets to put Malvolio in his place, and she gets to rehire Feste into his job again, right? So on the one hand, when I think about this scene, it suggests to me that wit thrives in a more chaotic context than is sustainable for a social order, but that ultimately it's moving toward a reestablishment of boundaries between people that make a social order possible, right?
I wonder whether Hope or Abel have any comments on what the dynamics of the scene means to them as actors who are, in some ways dealing with similar issues on stage as this household is dealing with in terms of attention, response, mending, repairing, being open, being free and generous, being critical. I feel like there's a whole sort of assembly of issues in this scene that are so powerful.
First and foremost, like the where Feste is coming from is a much deeper question to me, because I know, like, if I'm not mistaken, he never really says why he was soul searching for X amount of time, however long he was gone. I can't help but to think that, like, the death of Olivia's brother is like the cause of this. And I don't know if that's just like kind of just like how I took him or what, but yeah, I don't know. I think the beautiful thing about this play in general is that it is a comedy, but it only works because it comes out of this really great sense of loss, which is a big thing we're all going through right now. I think this play is kind of perfect for right now, actually. But and it is interesting, Sean, because it's kind of like I don't specifically apologize, but I don't get fired. So yeah, I don't know. I definitely, like, a scene like this, a character like this is something I would like to work on more. Just like, what are the specifics of these tactics?
I find Malvolio is such an interesting, sad character. Every time he opens his mouth, he sticks his foot all the way down his throat. He wants so desperately to be something that he's not. And as we look at him throughout the play, and we watch what happens to him because of his own overbearing attitudes that are masking such an insecurity, and then he ends up in such a sad, desperate situation. I find that he is so representative of so much of humanity. We want so desperately to be something, to be something. And unless we think very carefully, we end up making more mistakes than we don't. And I think that he is probably one of the saddest characters that Shakespeare ever wrote.
Yeah, my question was more about the first passage that we read.
Yes.
And it was more about the kind of mending issue, and then between the idea of virtue and sin. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know if that was just, if I'm right in thinking that's a very cynical kind of position that Feste is taking. And also, I think the point one of you made about the two men have to kind of instruct her now on how she should behave, and that seemed kind of really not taking into account what Viola's own abilities are. I know it's the Renaissance, and you need that sort of male person in your view. I think the second passage really shows Viola saying, well, there's no sin or there's no slander in what an allowed fool will say. And there she seems to really kind of put that idea up front. So just a comment and question about the first one, if it was meant to be kind of cynical, to put virtue and sin together and then just talk about it as being patched or mended. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne.
Oh, I know you're short on time, so I'll be quick. I just wanted to say to Sean's comment about the, I can't remember how you put it, Sean, exactly, but instability in social situations and in communities. And I think it's fascinating that this debate about humor, what is funny, what is comedic, is still going on today. And can you be funny without making fun of people? What is the role of racist humor, sexist humor? Is that acceptable? Can women be funny? All of these are being debated in the entertainment industry and in our culture.
I think that's a brilliant comment, and I'm really glad you made it. I mean, when I think about Twelfth Night and what happens to Malvolio over the whole play, I think that part of what it has to say to us is that, one, if your skin is so thin that you can't take a joke about yourself and you can't see that you might be ridiculous in somebody else's eyes, then there is something really wrong, not only with your perspective on yourself and other people, but maybe with the whole social fabric, right? That's supposed to allow for us to make fun of each other and to behave ridiculously and be made fun of by each other, right? But on the other hand, the comedy is also so focused on the fact that there's always a price to pay for laughing at someone or being laughed at. And in this play, this is to go back to what Jan just said about Malvolio being such a sad character. I mean, not only is he the only major character in the play who doesn't marry up by the end out of his class into a better situation, but he is pushed to the bottom in a state of total humiliation, right? So this is what I was trying to say about Shakespeare's ambivalence toward comedy. And I agree with you, Anne, that it is a version of the ambivalence that we now have about it ourselves. But I do think he's not looking for a society in which we can't tolerate being laughed at, right? Because that would be a society of Malvolios, right?
Can I make one observation?
Yes, and then we're going to switch to making some announcements. Go ahead,
Okay.
Paul.
I mean, often in the theatre, we say what's different at the end of the scene from at the beginning. How has the play moved on? Yeah. And it seems to me that Malvolio has been in what Sean, I think, rightly identifies as a household without political leadership, because it's a woman in mourning alone. Probably Malvolio's had a marvelous time while Feste's been away. He may have been away looking for another job at Orsino's. And at the end of the job, so both of these, that there is nobody ruling the household. And by the end of it, Wit has given, or the god Mercury has given Olivia, she's back in the saddle, it seems to me.
I agree. I mean, I think that she is kind of taken through this Socratic dialogue, and then she becomes Socrates to Malvolio. So I see her as very much organizing the second movement or the third movement of the scene.
Just as one underlying note on Malvolio, do you all know the story of Donald Sinden playing Malvolio at Stratford?
No.
He came out at the beginning of one of his scenes onto the set on which there was a sundial. And he wandered out, looked at his watch, looked at the sundial, did a double take at his watch, and altered the angle of the sundial. It's a very good piece of business.
Well, I'm looking at my sundial.